Hi, I'm Pastor Thomas Dunn from Crown Hill Mennonite Church, and welcome back to our series on solidarity. In this segment, you'll hear Pastor Kevin interview Pastor David Hargrave on Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter may be one of the most politicized of the segments we're going to talk about here. I'm sure in all of your social media feeds and your news outlets and maybe in your discussions with your family, you've heard strong opinions about this. One of the things that Kevin and Pastor Dave talk about is they discuss a differentiation between Black Lives Matter, the organization, and Black Lives Matter, the concept. And so we're going to ask you to try to make that differentiation in your head as well. There is an entity, an organization, a political organization that has the title Black Lives Matter. And Dave talks about how that organization is not necessarily a Christian organization. It doesn't speak to all the things that he would agree with, and that's probably true for most people. But there's also the concept of Black Lives Matter, the idea that Black Lives Matter. So as you watch this video, again, pay attention to the nuances of the discussion, but also try to separate those two things. So when you hear Black Lives Matter, don't jump to maybe the worst things that you've heard or the perceptions you have about the organization, but think about the concept of Black Lives Mattering. So enjoy the conversation that Kevin and David have.
Well, since you opened the can of worms, let's go to that can of worms. And so, again, you're all these hot button topics. I've been in the same conversations where people are saying, Black Lives Matter, don't all lives matter? And that's gotten a lot of comments on social media. I've been in those conversations too, so let's talk about it. What do you say to the person who gets pretty miffed and says, David, all lives matter? How would you answer that?
Well, first, I would just smile and hold it in if it's not an intimate circle.
Okay.
But if it's someone that really wants to know, here's how I would answer it. And I'll answer it with a question. Have you ever heard someone say, all lives matter, after they've stated, or in response to someone saying, blue lives matter? Have you ever heard the, I don't want to say rebuttal, but the automatic response to blue lives matter, someone saying, all lives matter? Or in your own experience, informal polls, and then I'll tell you what I have observed, whether it's social media or in person. But I'll ask you first.
Yeah, my answer to that, no, I've never heard an all lives matter to any of those.
When you're talking about blue lives or police officers, which I greatly respect. Mm-hmm. So it leads me to believe that when the statement all lives matter is made, it is because people are uncomfortable with focusing on Black lives and the fact that Black lives have not been valued. And so it's ironic to me. Just go on social media and look for it's generally evangelical Christians who say all lives matter. And if you look at those comments, they will, all the ones that I've seen, are in response to someone posting or saying or stating Black Lives Matter. I think that's kind of ironic. If the true message is all lives, it would be a response no matter which class or group of people that are being discussed.
Yeah. You know, David, something that helped me, and I don't know, maybe you can say whether or not this is accurate, but I was reading an article in the Cleveland Plain Dealer, and the reporter was saying, he used this analogy. He said, okay, after the Boston Marathon bombing, which was a terrible, horrible thing, happened, you had people with T-shirts and posters and whatnot that said Boston Strong. And of course, I think most people in our country were, rallying behind Boston because it was just a terrible, horrible, awful event. But you didn't, in response to the marathon bombing, have people who were suddenly upset saying, well, what about Cleveland Strong? What about Miami Strong? What about Indianapolis Strong? Of course, all of our cities matter and the residents of those cities, but there's just the importance of showing the tragedy that's happened in Boston. That really opened it up for me. I mean, of course we are all made in the image of God, but what I've seen in my circles is that it seems like we get so caught up in these things we're talking about right now, it derails us from talking about what's right in front of us, which is race. We will talk until we're blue in the face about all of these other issues, and we won't really address the racism that's right before us. That's what I've seen, and so it derails us from the good, productive reconciling that we could possibly do. I don't know if you want to respond to that at all, or
yes, I'll respond to that. You'll just have to remind me, because there are a couple more Black Lives Matter things that I'd like to, just since we're talking.
Sure.
Let's go for broke. There is what I have observed and experienced. There is and I think perhaps it is, it's not intentional, but there exists, from my perspective, the belief, the practice, I don't know the best word to use, that black lives are inferior and second class. That is embedded even in subtle and in subtle ways, and many times people are unaware, but that is prevalent. And so with the Black Lives Matter thing, I remember years ago when Colin Kaepernick first knelt during the national anthem, and he got advice from a Green Beret. Back then, he shared that he was advised, here's the way that you can respect the flag, but also protest, peaceful protesting. He did that, and I would still, when I look at the response for evangelical Christians and patriotic people, he was denigrated, lost his job, and it was a really big issue. And then there were those who were saying, well, the only reason he's not a quarterback is because he's not that good. Or I didn't like him as a quarterback anyway. And so now, full circle, after the death of George Floyd and the subsequent protests, and when things were really escalating, people were, what I heard was, why not peacefully protest? Like Dr. King did. Why not? Like, why do, David, help me understand why so many black people are have resorted to violence. And on the inside, I had to chuckle so I would not cry, because an example of a public figure who found a peaceful way to protest was shut down. Until now, and then the NFL acknowledged that it was discriminate. He was treated unfairly because of that peaceful protest. But that's not new. Another thing that evangelicals like to use are the words and efforts and works of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And he is held up as the example of how to protest and how to work for justice. But in his letter from the Birmingham jail, at that time, during the civil rights era, white Christians and priests, pastors were all telling him he was wrong. He should not protest. Now wasn't the time. That wasn't the way. It's too much. People were not in support. As a whole, white Christians were not in support of the civil rights movement, even the things that Martin Luther King Jr. was doing. And what was pointed out were the things that the Nation of Islam and Malcolm X and some of the more militant, the Black Panther Party and so on, Christians during that time were wanting to use that to silence and shut Dr. King down. That ties to me. It speaks again to the fact that there is something afoot that would keep black people silenced and second class and on the margins. There are exceptions. There are people that can get pushed through, but and I hope. So as we transition and get back to your other question, I hope that as awareness is raised, that there is a general softening and a general willingness to be curious, not just from white people, but I think from all races and cultures, to be curious about someone else's experiences, their journeys, their preferences, without judgment. You may not like the things that I like, but we don't have to have judgment because of those differences.
Yeah. And David, just as someone who's grown up in the Mennonite church, I know that our history in the civil rights movement was complex. We can champion the fact that Martin Luther King did actually speak, I think, at Bethel Mennonite. I'd have to do my research on that. I think he was there. Or I'm sorry, Bethel College. Bethel College, excuse me. But even with that, I think that wasn't necessarily the norm throughout the Mennonite church. From what I've heard from the generation above me, there was the same disagreement on whether to support the civil rights movement that was happening at large was, yes, very much present in the Mennonite church. So this is something we've had to work through and need to continue to work through today. You mentioned earlier, I don't know if we checked off all that you wanted to address. We've gone a lot of places here. You did want to talk a little more, I think, about Black Lives Matter or some issues around that, or have you covered what you'd like to say regarding that?
There's more that could be said, but I would not want this interview to be overkill. I would like for it to be introductory and sure, soft enough to where sure, people are willing to explore, and hopefully this will evoke more conversations from all who hear it, by people of color they know, and amongst each other. So I think I'll leave Black Lives Matter alone for now.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Pastor Kevin and Pastor Dave, for that discussion. I hope that was as enlightening for all of you as it was for me to listen to. So I encourage you to turn to the people or in your space, or if you're having a discussion virtually on Zoom, whatever the case may be, to discuss a little bit of what you have heard. So the first discussion question I would like you to talk about a little bit is the scenario that Kevin talked about, the thing that he read that really kind of changed his mind when he discussed the Boston bombing and the Boston Strong movement. And just ask yourself or discuss amongst your group, were you, assuming that no one in this video is from Boston, we're probably mostly Wayne County, was anyone here offended when you heard of Boston Strong? And if you were not offended, which I assume no one was, why do you think people become offended at the Black Lives Matter, but are not offended at things like Boston Strong? I thought that was a great example that Pastor Kevin gave. So please discuss that amongst your group. Another discussion that I encourage you guys to have in your group, in whatever setting that is what Dave brought up about how people respond differently to the Blue Lives Matter slogan as opposed to Black Lives Matter. So again, I'd ask you to ask each other that question that Dave posed. Have you ever heard anyone respond with the phrase, all lives matter, when you hear someone say, Blue Lives Matter? And if not, why do you think that is? Why do you think people respond with, all lives matter, when they hear someone say Black Lives Matter, but when they hear someone say Blue Lives Matter, they don't typically respond with all lives matter? And why do you think there is that discrepancy? Okay, again, thank you for listening, and especially thank you to Pastor Hargrave and Pastor Kevin for being vulnerable and open for this discussion, and we hope that this is a fruitful discussion for you as you go from here.